My name is Chris Morris. I'm an archivist at the Computer History Museum, and today I'm interviewing Duncan Epping for the VMware Founders Collection. Today is October 9th, 2023, and this interview will become part of the permanent collection at the Computer History Museum. Duncan, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So if you could just say for the record your full name, your title, and your current home base.
Sure. My name is Duncan Epping. I'm a Chief Technologist working for the Cloud Infrastructure Business Group at VMware. And I live in the Netherlands, so, a long way out.
Yes, we're definitely at different time zones today. I think thank you, technology, for making this possible. Tell us a little bit about your educational and career background leading up to working at VMware.
Yeah, sure. Before I actually joined VMware, the education that I did is probably somewhere between an associate degree and a bachelor degree, the way it is in the US. In the Netherlands, it works slightly different. So we have different kinds of levels. So the way you go through school is kind of different than it is in the US, but it's somewhere around that bachelor degree-ish. Mm-hmm. And back when I was in school, I already had an affinity with computers. So I ended up doing a computer degree, which was probably one of the first degrees that they had in Europe. Back then, I was born in 1974, so I went through this probably late 80s. And there were some computers here and there, but there wasn't too much. So, I was one of those people that was interested in computers, playing games and stuff like that, and figuring out, tinkering with technology, figuring out how stuff works. And that's why I actually wanted to move in that space. And that's how I got started. Basically started as a system administrator, working for various companies. One of the first companies I actually worked for was a huge software company as well, which was Oracle back in the days. And when I worked for Oracle, I actually was a system administrator. So I mainly worked on Windows machines, some Linux machines as well. And the funny thing is that thinking back about that period, we were actually managing the systems for all of the support engineers in the Netherlands. And one of the first things that we had to figure out is how we actually could run multiple operating systems on a single machine. And back in the day, VMware actually had a solution. Now, do mind, I never had heard about VMware before, and we played around with it, but I completely forgot about it. So even when I started working at VMware, I actually had to really put things together. And it took me a couple of years before I figured out that I'd seen the technology before when I actually joined VMware at that point. So it was a funny anecdote in terms of how I got in touch with VMware technology. But like I said, that was the very first time I got in touch with it. But I, didn't really follow up on it because I didn't really understood what it could do for us as a company. Definitely not for the industry as a whole.
So, how did you land the job at VMware? You started in 2008, is that right?
Yeah, correct. I started in 2008, and it is quite interesting because back then I worked for a consultancy company. There was a fairly small partner in the Netherlands. We had about 75 people on board back then, and we probably had a team of 10, 15 consultants working primarily on VMware. And I joined that company probably about 12 to 14 months before I ended up joining VMware. And I joined the company because I just wanted to focus on VMware technology. I worked for an insurance company at first. I actually did the implementation of VMware technology back in the day for that insurance company. And then because I got so excited about the technology, I saw all of the possibilities of the technology. I just knew that this was going to take off. So I just wanted to be part of that thing that was happening in the industry. And that's why I joined that consultancy company. Now, as I joined the consultancy company, another thing happened for me personally. I started my own blog, and I started blogging about VMware technology. And that's how I got on the radar of VMware itself, because some of the folks that work for the company saw my name popping up here and there. They saw some of the articles that I wrote. They used some of my articles to solve the problems that they were facing for their customers. So they ended up asking me if I wanted to join the company as a senior consultant back in 2008. So that's how I ended up joining VMware.
So you said that you kind of saw what the product could do, or what by this time VMware was 10 years old, right? So there's kind of starting to be a range of products. What were the things that you thought that the products could do and that you were sort of excited about?
Yeah, it was a very interesting point in time in terms of where the industry was heading towards and what was happening as well from a compute perspective. what we were seeing in a lot of data centers is that they were growing at immense rate. So we saw this trajectory of data centers not having the space, cooling, or power capabilities to allow for additional operating systems to be spun up. So at that point in time, you need to make changes to allow for that. And one of those solutions that catered for it, or actually the only solution at that point in time that really catered for it, was VMware. So that's how I got in, how I got to know the solution itself at first. For me, it was just a solution that allowed us to simply power on more than we would normally be able to do, because we were virtualizing systems instead of having physical boxes. We had virtual machines. Now, quickly after we've actually gone through that very first exercise, the very first thing that, of course, popped up was the fact that you could live migrate a virtual machine from one physical machine to another physical machine. And that completely turned things upside down, because that allowed us to actually do maintenance, for instance, on hardware during the day, which normally would never be possible, because that would directly impact the users of an application. If you would, bring a physical machine down and it was running something like Microsoft Exchange or Microsoft SQL or maybe an Oracle database, it would immediately impact everyone using those systems. But in this particular case, we could simply move virtual machines around, still do maintenance on the hardware, while the user was still using those systems. And that was probably the point in time where I realized, hey, this is something completely different. They haven't only, created that abstraction layer that allows you to run things virtually, but on top of that, they've also included functionality to be a bit more smart in terms of how you could do maintenance, how you operate those systems, how you roll out those systems, etc. So it wasn't just that tiny aspect of the virtualization, but it was the management of the platform that I think was unique.
And I know that you also have done a lot of training and certifications. Can you talk about that journey?
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that was also very interesting in terms of seeing what was happening in the industry. Back in the days, I think when I started with IT, everyone wanted to be a Microsoft certified system engineer. And then when VMware got around, the whole new thing was becoming a VCP, a VMware certified professional. And then, of course, after that, multiple different certifications started popping up. And I think probably one of the most prestige ones was the VMware Certified Design Expert certification. This was the top of the line certification. And when we started out, and when I started out, there wasn't anything really in place yet. So there were 5 people that were originally certified back then for this particular certification itself. The first thing you had to do is you had to become a VCP. Then there were 2 additional exams that you had to complete. And then the 4th thing that you had to do is you had to go in front of a panel and actually defend a design that you've created verbally. So you would literally go through the exercise, explain to them what different kinds of design decisions you made, why, what some of the limitations were, what the requirements were, and why you ended up in a particular situation, why you picked a particular design over another design. And that was a very interesting experience, I must say. And it was really fun. I was the first person outside of those original 5 that came out of the room that got certified. The interesting thing is that because multiple people walked out of the room roughly around the same time, but I was, as I said, I was the first one that walked out. So I was capable of actually picking my VCDX number, which then ended up being VCDX 007, which is probably the coolest number that you could pick. So yeah, it was a fun experience. And the interesting thing is with the VCDX program itself, there's literally a few hundred people in the world that have been able to obtain that certification. So it's still very special. We don't have 1,000 people that have that certification. It's literally a couple of hundred. Now for VCP, that's completely different. There are thousands and thousands of VCPs, but for VCDX, there's only a couple of hundred because it's fairly difficult to obtain. And yeah, this whole process, there's a lot of requirements to it. So not many people are taking that on or have taken that on in the last couple of years.
How long was that process for you? Can you give us a sense of the time, the commitment, sort of time, energy, focus to get to the VCDX?
Yeah, I think for me, it was probably different than for most people. If you look at most people, the time that they have to commit to it in terms of starting at VCP and doing all of the other requirements and then submitting a design typically takes a year and a half, 2 years. For me, I literally had 6 months to complete it because we were the first going through the exercise. They kind of used us as a beta or an alpha program to say, And that was an interesting experience because we were literally doing, one exam on Monday, then do the next exam on Wednesday, do the third exam on Friday. And then a couple of weeks later, we had to submit our design so that we could go in front of a panel a couple of weeks after that. And of course, they were rushing us. Well, not really rushing us, but they were pushing us to go through the system because they also needed additional panel members to conduct those exams with other folks. So, I, for instance, conducted one of the... I actually conducted the first exam of a person outside of VMware going through the process itself. So that was also very interesting seeing that how they would take on the effort because, they didn't have all of the material, for instance, that we had available. So that was very interesting to see how they would actually go about, for instance, writing their design itself or defending some of the justifications in terms of the design itself. So very interesting at times. But like I said, for me, it was a bit different than it was for other folks.
Can you say anything about how the program has evolved? What's been added or what's been changed over the years?
Yeah, I think when we started out, the program itself, we had some very specific sections in terms of the things that we needed to do during the verbal part of the design itself. And after probably like 5 or 6 rounds of going through it, we actually noticed that some of those components that we included didn't add the value that we expected it would add. So some of the different components changed, but for the vast majority, it's actually still fairly the same as it was in the past. I think the biggest change that we've seen is that when I actually did the exam, you could become a VCDX. That was it. You were a VMware certified design expert. And then later on, they actually introduced all of the different options for VCDX as well. So you could be a VCDX for end user computing. You could be a VCDX for networking. You could be a VCDX for data center, for instance. Because VMware, over the course of the years, also started evolving and started moving into these different spaces. And some of these spaces became more strategic to the company, like, for instance, end user computing. So that's why they ended up creating these additional pathways as well for VCDX. So I think that's probably the biggest change that we've seen over the years.
Can you think back to your early days at VMware? You had specifically charted a path to get to that job at VMware. So what was it like when you got the job and actually joined the team?
Yeah, that was very interesting when I joined the team. It's funny because I think there were a couple of key moments in the history of VMware in terms of features and functionality that we released. But of course, as with any company, VMware makes mistakes as well. And the very first week that I joined, we actually had one of the biggest bugs that happened probably in the history of VMware, which is called the time bomb. And basically what happened is that every single environment worldwide got a notification that their license was about to expire. I think that was in August of 2008. And I joined in July of 2008. So I was actually going through my first week of training, and we started to receive calls from customers that we had, connections with throughout Europe. And all of them were reaching out to us. Hey, I got this message on my console. Do you know what it means? How can I get rid of it? And that's when we found out we had this massive bug. So that was a very interesting point in time when I joined. But these things happen, of course, with every company. So that was it was quite chaotic, I could say.
And how did VMware respond to that event?
Well, I think that was probably the most interesting thing because I felt, I joined back in the days, and a lot of people will tell you that it was different when I joined. They felt it was still a small company, but for me, it was a huge company that I joined. Multiple thousands of people, very clear processes defined in terms of how you develop software, how you develop patches, etc., etc. But the way that they responded to it, that is what surprised me most. And that is probably what I also appreciated most about the company is they knew they had an issue. They quickly shifted the gears, started fixing the problem, and started shipping the fix for that problem as well to customers extremely fast. And I think that is probably one of the things that I appreciated most, not just at that point in time, but over the last decade or so working at VMware, some of the problems that I've seen and the way that the engineers and the product managers have gone about solving those problems for our customers. I think that is probably what I've appreciated most, but I'm also pretty sure that what our customers have appreciated most about VMware as a company.
Mm-hmm. I've heard a lot about the sense of trust that customers have for VMware, and also just the enthusiasm that customers have for the product. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that stand out with VMware as a company. I've been working for VMware almost 16 years now, and the one thing that stands out to me is whenever I talk to customers, first of all, everyone is excited about the technology, but also the culture of VMware. And I think there's multiple aspects to the culture, of course, because there's the people aspect. But one of the things that I think is probably biggest when it comes to VMware as a company, what it feels like is that everyone is very involved with our customers. It's not just about selling to our customers, but it's about understanding what kind of problems they are trying to solve and then trying to figure out if we can actually help them with it and how we can help them best. And I think that is probably what differentiates us from a lot of other companies out there. And just to give an example, as part of my role, I get to talk to a lot of customers out there, and the conversation is typically the way that these things go about is pretty straightforward. It's one of the sales teams that reaches out to me and says, you know what, I think there's an opportunity here. Can you talk to the customer about the product that I'm responsible for, in this particular case, vSAN, which is a storage product. So I typically end up then talking to the customer, explaining to them what it is that the product does. And then I try to figure out if what they are doing and what they are looking for actually matches what we offer from a product or services perspective. And if that doesn't match, then my answer is probably going to be, I would keep on using what you're using today. And the reason for that is that I'd rather see a happy VMware customer using, let's say, 70% of our technology than an unhappy customer using 90% of our technology. And I think that is something that you will see with a lot of VMware people across the board. They care about the customers, and they care about solving difficult problems for our customers as well. And not just push the product itself, but actually focus on what it is they're trying to solve.
So you mentioned that some folks within VMware would probably say that it was a small company in 2008 compared to what it is now. To you, it was a big company. How has the culture of VMware changed through the growth of the last 15 years?
Yeah, I think, in ways, of course, it has changed. I think over the last 6-7 years, I think we've all seen some change in some shape or form, but that I wouldn't necessarily say that it is the culture that has changed. It's more that a lot of the processes have changed because of the size of the company. And I think a lot of people will say, that's part of the culture as well. But in my opinion, it's almost impossible to run a company of this size and not have proper processes in place to ensure that actually everyone is following all of the different policies and regulations that there are, not just from a company perspective, but probably also from a governmental perspective. So, yeah, I think if I look at the culture itself, I think it's still fairly open. It's one of the things that I was very surprised about at the start. You could walk up to one of the CTOs, you could walk up to the CEO and have a conversation. You could walk up to any of the product managers or email them and explain to them what kind of challenges customers had. And I think that is still very much the case. You can still walk up to our CTO, Kit Colbert, and have a conversation with him and explain to him what some of the challenges are of our customers, and maybe have a discussion in terms of how he thinks that we can solve those problems. And you can still walk up to any product manager and explain to him or her what the challenges are of the product that they own, and potentially even, give a suggestion in terms of how they can make changes to the product to ensure that it actually meets the requirements of the customers itself. So I think from that perspective, not a lot had actually changed. And of course, if you look at the people that work for the company, although there's many more, I still feel that, the vibe within the company is still very much the same. It still feels like VMware of the past, to me at least.
Who are some of the people who have had the most impact on your career at VMware?
Yeah, I think that is a question that I had to think about long and hard. I think over the last 15 years, there were a couple of people that influenced me probably most when it comes to career progression. I think one of the managers that I had in the early days when I was part of the technical marketing team was Morné Vanderwold. And one of the things that still stands out to me is that whenever we had a conversation, he would always tell me to not bring in problems, but actually come up with a solution. And that's probably one of those things that helped me change my mindset in terms of how I would think about some of the challenges that I would face, and think about the problems first, then try to figure out, okay, what can I do about it? And potentially what can other folks do about it? And then actually try to figure out, where do I need to go within the organization to solve that particular problem, instead of just emailing it to the next person and say, this is the problem that we have. Right. Can you have a look at it? I think that is probably one of those things that helped me a lot over the years in terms of the shift of where my focus should be when it comes to those different types of things. And one of the other folks that helped me a lot over the years is not actually someone within VMware, but is someone who was very close to VMware, and that was Chad Sackage with EMC. Chad was one of the technologists that worked for EMC, and he was a avid public speaker. And I wasn't too keen on public speaking back in the day, and he was probably one of those folks that pushed me the hardest to do my best to get better at it. And that is probably something that helped me the most, because I felt that in order to progress my career, I needed to make sure that I was capable of delivering a presentation for, any type of audience. And, working with him, having conversations with him definitely helped me a lot over the years to, get over that uncomfortable feeling, that hurdle to go up on stage and present in front of, whatever it ended up being. Could be 1,200 people at VMworld in the early days, or, doing the BU keynote a couple of years ago in front of 2,500 people, for instance. So yeah, he was definitely a big influence on me.
Tell me about this transition to the chief technologist role. You talked a little bit about one component is really being out there and being a spokesperson, a voice. But it does take you sort of away from maybe some of the nuts and bolts. So what is that like for you?
Yeah, it was an interesting transition. And there's actually a funny story attached to it. When I was part of the R&D organization, I'm actually still part of the R&D organization, but when I joined the R&D organization, before that, I was actually part of the technical marketing team. And we moved from technical marketing into R&D because our team came up with a potential product, which back in the day was called Project Marvin, which ended up being EvoRail, and EvoRail actually ended up evolving into VxRail, which is basically a hyperconverged solution which is sold by Dell at the moment. Now, because I moved from the technical marketing team over into the R&D team, the position that I had within the technical marketing team, the title that I had, didn't really translate to what I was doing for R&D. The interesting thing also is that within the technical marketing team, I had a principal title, but that principal title was also protected within R&D because we had principal engineers, and there was, it had a certain meaning within the organization, so they couldn't necessarily give me that principal title. So they had to change my title back then. And what they then ended up doing is they went in front of the principal board and they actually proposed for me to become a principal engineer. Now, because of the work that I was doing, I didn't really fit the profile of a developer or an engineer. So when they went through it, they could score me really well on some of the aspects, but they couldn't score me at all on some of the other aspects. So that proposal ended up being declined. So what ended up happening is, because I was in a very specific position and they still wanted to give me a title that actually meant something within the company, but outside of the company as well, they created this new role, which was a Chief Technologist role within VMware, which then became this official career path afterwards for the other folks as well. So that was very interesting. And as a Chief Technologist back then, as I joined the R&D organization working for the EvoRail team, or the VxRail team as it's called today, it's interesting because my focus was outbound, but also inbound. So one of the things that I would, for instance, do is I would have conversations with customers one-on-one, but also at events, or I would present on certain topics, and then based on the feedback that they would give, I would try to translate it more to, engineering language, and then give it back to the engineering team and to the product management team to see if they could actually do something with it in terms of features or functionality. So yeah, as my title changed, my role also started changing slightly, but I was still fairly heavily involved with technology. Of course, over the years, that aspect of technology in terms of the nuts and bolts and actually getting your hands dirty. I still have a lab, but I don't, get to spend as much time in the lab as I would like to. But yeah, that's part of the role, I guess. It's the natural transition in terms of being a principal architect or a consultant, and then moving into the technologist space where you're more talking about technology and trying to figure out what it is, where customers are actually moving towards. So where is the industry heading, and does it actually align with what we are doing as a company? So, yeah, it is less technical from that perspective, but it's also, in my opinion, more interesting maybe to say.
Is there a project or a product that you've worked on that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things that I've worked on over the last couple of years. As I mentioned, one of the things that I was part of as one of the founding members was the VxRail team, or the EvaRail team back in the day. That was very interesting. And the interesting thing about that project probably is it was one of the first projects that, from a Office of CTO perspective, went through what they called back then X Labs. So basically, it was a startup project funded by VMware within the company, and we were running it as a startup as well. So we literally had a handful of engineers sitting in a room trying to figure out how stuff worked and what we could create in terms of a new project or a new product for the company, a new revenue stream for the company. And we came up with this concept called EvaRail back in the day. I think the most interesting aspect of the project itself, for me personally, and hopefully that goes for the other folks as well, even though it wasn't a successful product for VMware itself, the product right now is extremely successful. So if you look at the amount of revenue that Dell does for VxRail specifically, I think they surpassed over $2 billion worth of revenue for VxRail alone. That was a couple of years ago that I saw the last update. So it is a huge project. And like I said, the interesting thing is that for VMware specifically, it wasn't successful, but that was probably because of it was probably more a market-wise thing that actually was a technology thing, because it is extremely successful for VMware, but our route to market probably didn't align too well with what VMware would normally be doing, but it lent itself extremely well for Dell. So that was a very interesting experience. And then, yeah, over the course of the last 15 years, I've been involved with, various new products, things like vSAN. I was involved from day one as part of EvaRail, of course, as well. But then over the last 8 years as the Chief Technologist, who primarily talks about vSAN. And then one of the other products that I was closely involved with when it was launched, actually two products I was closely involved with. The first one being Site Recovery Manager, which is an orchestration platform for disaster recovery platforms or disaster recovery solutions. And then the second one was VMware Cloud Director. I was one of the first folks that implemented VMware Cloud Director at a location in Europe. So we had initially, for the launch of VMware Cloud Director, we had 3 partners worldwide. I was responsible for the European partner, which was called back in the day. So I got to spend about half a year in London as a result, building out that architecture and building out that design. And that was a very interesting experience, because we were doing something that no one had done before. We were implementing something that we hadn't even seen ourselves yet. We were literally trying to figure out how stuff worked, on the fly as we were going through it. So that was a very interesting experience, and also very challenging, of course, but you get to learn a lot in those situations.
Tell us a little bit about the main drive right now. What is the thing you're talking to customers and to your teams the most?
Yeah, if we're talking about customers, one of the things that I talk about most, first of all, is where are we today and where are we heading towards in the future? And of course, whenever you talk to customers today, the majority of customers are talking about trying to figure out what they're doing with the legacy applications and refactoring some of those legacy applications in some cases. In some cases, they also say we're not refactoring anything. What we're doing today actually works. And then what we're actually trying to figure out for them is how can we optimize the platform that you have, whether that is on premises, whether that is in the cloud, or a combination of both, which it typically ends up being. That's something that we try to help them with. And then, of course, internally, we're trying to figure out from a feature set perspective, but also from a services perspective, what customers are moving towards. Is that something that we have within the platform available right now? And one of the things that comes up with customers today all the time is, of course, ransomware. It's one of those things that I think a lot of customers, unfortunately, a lot of organizations are faced with. And as VMware, we have multiple solutions to help customers with that. But we're now also trying to figure out if we can do that more elegantly and more in a more efficient way and a more cost-effective way for customers as well. And I think that is something that not only us are challenged with, but I think industry-wide folks are challenged with, because it's a real problem, and we're seeing attacks happening, unfortunately, on a daily basis. And we're also seeing customers trying to recover on a daily basis. And in some cases, they can't recover. And we've actually seen customers literally stop their business completely as a result because they couldn't afford paying the ransom. So, that is something that is, I think, on top of mind, not just for us, but for everyone out there at this point in time.
Last question on my list, which we ask everybody. What do you think is the lasting impact of VMware's technology?
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question. I think if you look at the world of IT today, where we are today with cloud technology, I don't think there would have been anything that resembles anything even closely to what we have available today. And I'm not just talking about VMware-based clouds, but I'm talking about every single public cloud solution out there. Although they may not be based on VMware technology directly, they are definitely based on a lot of the concepts that VMware has introduced in terms of all of the different abstraction layers. And I'm not just talking about the compute abstraction layers. I'm also talking about the storage abstraction layers. I'm talking about the networking abstraction layers. And I think by the innovation that we've seen over the past, 2.5 decades, we've introduced so many different concepts for the world of IT specifically, that where we are today, we would have never been there. And I suspect that it is something that we will see ongoing for the upcoming decades to come. It is not something that will probably not, I don't think we will see that changing in my lifetime even. The technology that we are using today will be using for many years to come, hopefully.
That's all I have. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Awesome.